Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. So I took a week off there, went on a family vacation, and I'm back now, and I got a preview for you of some of the stuff I've been listening to the past few weeks. Again, these previews are designed to kind of give some first impressions or maybe just some superficial ideas about some albums I've been listening to before maybe I dive a little bit deeper into some of them and maybe shed some light on some of the darker corners of those albums. So to not waste any time, because I got 6 albums to get through today, the first one is the Twin Peaks Season 2 soundtrack by Angelo, Badalamenti, and David Lynch. Now, this has sort of been a white whale for me for a long time. The Twin Peaks, original Twin Peaks soundtrack for the first season was a really big influence on me at a particular time in my life, as was Twin Peaks in general. Like it rushes to my musical taste, as Twin Peaks is sort of it to my TV taste. And the soundtrack for that was something that really stuck with me for a long time. So in about 2007, they actually released the Season 2 soundtrack, but it was a very limited release. And by the time I even had caught wind of it, it became very difficult to find. And I was a little bit apprehensive about getting it too, because I kind of was afraid that it would come off like sort of a bunch of B-sides, as much as I love that Season 1 soundtrack. But now we're sort of in a different era of Twin Peaks, the post-Season 3. And there's been sort of a repackaging and a revisiting of a lot of that era. So this has now recently come to light. As a matter of fact, the graphic that they have for it is very, in my opinion, influenced by the post-Season 3 aesthetic. My personal preference is the original album art, which is this. And that really gives me a little bit more of the evocative feeling of what this music kind of meant at the time I was listening to it. And one of the things that the Season 2 soundtrack really does well is it dodges the redundancy that sometimes shows up in a lot of Twin Peaks soundtracks. You know, for a Twin Peaks soundtrack to kind of get the right feel, they always have to kind of start off with the main theme of the piece. Now, they didn't do that with the Fire Walk With Me soundtrack, because that movie kind of stood on its own. But certainly whenever they redid Season 3, they took every chance to put the Laura Palmer theme on those soundtracks for Season 3, and even the soundtrack, the accompanying music soundtrack. And I got a little bit tiresome. I mean, I know those songs, and they help to set the tone, but it's definitely, by the time you've gotten to that 3 or 4 times, I've really heard that on the Season 1 soundtrack. I think it's an amazing piece of work, but, you know, why have it 3 or 4 different places? Season 2 very neatly dodges that problem by doing this like love intro. It's what they call the love intro theme. And it's sort of a little miniature compilation of a lot of those Season 1 themes, but kind of in a slightly different performance style. So they really did a very nice job of setting the tone for the Season 2 soundtrack without actually like doing things again from Season 1. Now, even though Twin Peaks Season 2 contains some of the highest points and lowest points of the entire run of the show, no matter what season you're talking about, the Season 3 music is anything but B-sides. It's not outtakes. The soundtrack brings back themes that are so important to the show, but that don't have another venue to be showcased. So I'm a big fan of Twin Peaks. I'm a big fan of this particular compilation. So certainly, if you are a Twin Peaks fan at all, and I don't want this to slip through your fingers, you should go out there and get this as quickly as possible. The Twin Peaks Season 2 soundtrack. Okay, the second disc I want to look at is a disc by the band called the Nels, which is the Nels' first disc. Now, a few weeks ago, about a month and a half ago, I guess, I covered the Nels 2, their second album. And as a result of that post, I was able to get in this little dialogue with Andrew McKinley about the album. He was very open about some of the compositional things that he went through on the album, and I got a hold of, through that communication with him, a copy of the first disc. And he told me, whenever he sent it to me preemptively, that, you know, there was something a little more epic about this album. It was a little bit more adventurous. And so I was very curious to see, you know, what that sounded like, what that would be. And he was absolutely right. I think that the Knells 1, the Knells is a very pretty unique approach. Again, if you look back on that post, it's the same thing here. They have, rather than having a lead vocalist, they have a trio of lead vocalists, a classically trained female ensemble, female trio. And one of the things I had kind of looked at the Knells 2, the album that comes after this one, was that there's sort of this weird kind of disparity between this sort of vocal style and a sort of a little bit more grounded rock style that they're playing in. That's not really the case on the Knells 1. On this first disc, I think that the music sort of rises to the occasion of backing these vocalists, and the vocalists also feel a bit more free. I asked Andrew McKenna-Lee actually in our communications, what changed? Had to have been a change in his mindset between the first, second album. They're both, in a very clearly related in style, but the freedom that he seemed to have on the first album, it's unusual that he would have kind of backed that off and tried to kind of make things a little bit more clear cut. And he told me that it was because of the complexities of performing the music from that first album or just a little bit much to surmount. If you're going to tour an album with a full string ensemble and the rehearsals and all this other things going into it, it was a pretty mammoth thing to put those songs on from this particular album. So he opted to pare it back a little bit so that on the Knells 2, there'd be less obstacles to performing those songs. So the good news is the Knells 1 has a very super adventurous, broad approach to it that I really like a lot. And considering that the Knells 2 ended up being a favorite from the year that I found it, I don't see how this could not still rank up there as one of my favorite albums from this year. It's really pretty impressive. So the first Knells album is definitely worth checking out. Delve into that one as well. Okay, the next one is a disc by Herbie Hancock, and it's a 1974 album called Thrust. Now, Thrust is the follow-up to probably one of his biggest hits pre-1980, this album called Headhunters, and this is the follow-up to that album. And it's a very, clearly a 70s jazz funk album. As I'm listening to it, it kind of reminds me of like the sound of late night TV when I was a little kid, Saturday Night Live and that. To me, sometimes it's difficult for me to get past the groove on this style of music. Because usually the groove, like it is here, it's very thick and it's very engaging. First listen, whenever I got this album, I kind of felt like, man, it's a little bit monotonous. And it's only because I think that those grooves, the really deep, thick grooves in the album really captured my attention. But that's not really the layer I should be listening to in an album like this, So once I kind of got that feel, like understood that was what was going on, a quick look underneath the surface of that groove is really where everything is happening. Herbie Hancock really shows his ability to use his voice on his own. I don't mean his physical voice, like his playing voice in this album. He makes the keyboards sing, and it's a combination of sort of his innovative use of electronic instruments and Fender Rhodes, and also like some effects that he uses. He's a big proponent, it seems like, of using sort of envelope filters and wah sounds on his keyboards, which brings them another level of expressiveness that isn't necessarily there with just the instrument without those effects on them. So Thrust is a really great example of this 1970s jazz funk style. Again, another album that I would really highly suggest checking out. The next album is by this artist named Sevish, and Sevish has this album called Harmony Hacker. One of Sevish's things is that he's into this style of music called Zen harmonic music. One of his projects is to examine and look at different ways of tuning notes. So, of course, if you know anything about our music, Western style music, we have an octave, and that octave is divided into 12 relatively equal notes for tuning purposes. And everything we do is based on those 12 notes. Well, what he and other Zen harmonic artists do is examine the possibilities of things like a 22-note scale. Or he has another song on one of his albums, it's a 53-note scale, where there's in an octave, there's 53 notes, or 22, or 10, or 15, and he divides them up evenly, and then finds music to play within that different tuning. Now, to your average ear, if you're just listening to this stuff, it can be pretty difficult to listen to, not because it's really like, offensive, but it's disorienting. If music's point is tension and release, then what Sevish does is extremely musical, because his jaunts, his explorations into these sort of microtonal systems cause a lot of tension. It's kind of again disorienting, but he's very good at releasing it. You'll hear other people who do Zen harmonic music and things that are not in normal 12-tone scales. And sometimes it's just weird. They just make music for the sake of being weird, and it's so far out you really can't grab onto it. But what Sevish is really pretty good at is actually making it work as a system. There's a sense of harmony that he uses, but he uses some harmonic conventions, but they sort of exist in different ways, and he manipulates them in different ways so that there's sort of harmonies between harmonies and things like that. It would be a very interesting project to look at how he did this, because overall it's a pretty effective exploration of these alternative tunings, and the average instrument's just not tuned that way. I mean, clearly you can do it in a computer and change the tuning, but how do you enter it? These are the things that I think would be interesting to look at. So the Harmony Hacker album is really very musical in its own way, but it's not for the faint of heart. If you're walking in there expecting to be lulled to sleep, there's some stuff in there that may give you some nightmares on the way out. So worth checking out, but prepare yourself. Okay, next one up. It's by this band called Bombay Groovy, and this album's called Odysee. Now, Odysee is a compilation of several different albums that they've had. Bombay Groovy is a Brazilian group. They consist of kind of a rock band, but with a guy who plays sitar quite a bit. I'm not super impressed with this album. I like parts of it. Partially that's because it is a compilation. So anytime you run into something that's a compilation, it's going to have an uneven feeling because it's just sort of snapshots from different parts of that given band's career. So it feels like there's like 2 or 3 songs that just kind of feel like kind of jam bandy grooves with some sitar over the top. And then there's some that are a little more complex, have a nice little kind of progressive rock aesthetic to them. But ultimately, my thing about it is that they're using sitar in a way that doesn't really pay a whole lot of respect to the instrument's history. That's just another form of kind of colonization. Parts of it do have some exciting moments, but I think compositionally it's a little bit on the slim side. So we'll see. I'm going to give that one another couple of spins. But of the ones I've been listening to recently, it's kind of the one that's fallen kind of the most flat, unfortunately. The last one the big moment is last Friday. Got up in the morning and got my copy of Tool's Fear Inoculum. Now, when I say I got my copy of, that's kind of an issue. They made this deluxe edition of the CD. It's very nice, and but it's sold out the pre-orders for it sold out before I even got to payday, and they didn't replenish it. So all those sold out. They were I'd say false scarcity, but there was like 10 copies sent to all the outlets. So those got all snatched up. So I had to end up getting an electronic copy, and I'm still kind of, peeved about that. I mean, I would have been happy with just a standard release too, but now it was either just the deluxe edition or nothing else, and that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. But I let it go because I'm a fan of Tool, and I support the band, and I'm really interested in seeing where they're going with this album. And of course, immediately as soon as the album was released, there's like scads and scads of reviews being popped up over the 2 or 3 days after the album is released. And I just feel like in an album like this one, that's premature. You always want to try to balance accessibility and complexity. And Tool's always had that balance very, very tipped very heavily towards the complexity, but were able to keep themselves accessible. I think they kind of let go of the accessibility a little bit on this one and really delved into the complexity. That's not terrible. Lord knows I'm a big fan of complexity in my music, but it just takes time to digest. I will give you 2 real quick hot takes though. Number 1, quite famously on this album, Maynard James Keenan is a little bit more reserved than he has been in the past, and that I think is a little bit of a detriment on the album. I get that maybe he's trying to save his voice a little bit. He's getting a little bit older. Maybe he can't go out there and scream every night on the whole tour, so maybe he's thinking ahead to that. But I think that there's some missed opportunities on this album for some intensity that the band kind of asks for, and that he just Maynard in the past would have delivered on that, and on this time he doesn't do it quite the same way. So that's a little bit of a criticism I would have. But I also think that Adam Jones's guitar playing is sort of at a new all-time high, especially in terms of like the sounds that he's using. There's just a broad variety of sounds that Adam Jones has on the album, really shines strongly on it. And of course, Danny Carey is Danny Carey. This is probably one of the most creative, like drumming wise, some of the most creative drumming he's done on this album. It's right up there with like some of Neil Peart's most creative drumming, like what he was doing in the 80s and early 90s. Really worth checking out. And of course, Justin Chancellor, the role that he plays is still very important on the album. I don't want to downplay what he's doing because he gives the whole thing this sense of space that I think that most bass players aren't really responsible for, and that's definitely one of his big roles. So I'm going to hold off on like a really big in-depth thing on Fear Inoculum because I think that it's in there, and I'm definitely starting to compile my thoughts on that. But it's something that I want to make sure that I have really thought through before I go put it out there and share it with you guys. Anyway, so that's the 6 albums I have for this roundup, stuff I've been listening to most recently. This is like the first fall roundup. There may be another one coming up towards maybe beginning of November. And at that point in time, we'll start looking at the album of the year. So things are going to start winding down as far as that goes. Actually, in some ways, winding up, depending upon what your point of view is on it. But for now, I'm going to leave you guys with these 6 albums. Please go check them out. And if you like the post, please like it and subscribe or share it with your friends. And until next time, which will hopefully be next week, I will catch you on the flip side.